of Ash and Flo. This is Unbillable Hours, a podcast about professional services marketing. Stick around to listen to our insights, tips, and best practices to improve your firm's marketing and even your career.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah. So, Flo, another Friday, another episode. What do you have for our people today?
Another episode of the Unbillable Hours podcast. I'm excited. Aren't you excited? It's a bit too warm to be super fantastically excited. Yeah, you and I talked about this, so we wanted to continue our mini series around data and research and insights and. Because I think you and I, we often talk about the importance of, as marketers, we should be able to bring client insights into pretty much everything we do, right? We might or might not have said it very often, but what we usually mean is bring insights from the source, right? So really develop your own insight into an understanding of your firm's clients and what they think.
Mm-hmm.
And we did do an episode on how to do client interviews and how to conduct those conversations.
Yes, and we've also had episodes where we talk to research leads and thought leadership people to talk about the entire inside process and everything. But as you and I both know, that's an expensive process.
Yeah. So not everybody can do what our friend Arohi does and drive 7-figure research programs to get to that sweet insight, right? So yeah, we thought, dear listeners, for this one, we would just do a listicle episode, right? That's not beneath us, Ash. We can do listicles.
Yeah, we can do listicles.
And we just thought we'd give you 11 ideas, right? You can count them off as you go through them for where you might find insightful conversations or where you might be able to elicit those.
Yes. And I guess when you're looking at insights, right, like it needs to inform things. That's the whole thing. Like, how do you get these insights to inform your marketing strategy, messaging, content, programs, things like that. But, you and I, when we were discussing, also came up with the thought that can these insights be good enough to advise on the overall business strategy?
Yeah. Can you find something that's so compelling that you can actually go back to the practice and say, you know what, you should have a service here or there, or you should maybe change the go-to-market approach altogether, these types of things. That's right. And I think you and I both agree you can find excellent insights if you talk to people, by which I mean have conversations, don't send surveys or buy market research papers, have conversations with the actual people. And the actual people obviously also should be representatives of your ideal client and ideal buyer personas. So don't just talk to Ash and myself if you're targeting CFOs for the marketing you do for your firm. Talk to actual CFOs, right?
Exactly.
So that would be the idea, at least. So and yeah, I guess our question for today is, how does one do that? And yeah, we listed 11 ideas. Maybe Ash, we can invite the listeners to submit more if they have other stealthy,
absolutely,
sneaky paths to get conversations with CFOs, to stick with that example.
So
we have 11. So do you want to do the
Flo,
first
no, I was literally going to ask you what's the first idea,
okay. But no, I'll do the first one, which is a lame one because it sort of goes slightly against what we just said, having conversations. But I think it can be helpful preparation for the conversation. So let's call it a proxy step, and the proxy step, of course, is immerse yourself in the trade press. That's catering to the vertical you're trying to get into. Attend events, right? Which that, by the way, is big because there you can meet people and you can have conversations, which those can be very informal. But again, sticking with my CFO example, let's see if I can carry that through. If you just wanted to know whether or not the change in the interest rates in Europe is actually a pain for CFOs or not that much, that would be one question you could ask the guy who's in front of you in the line of the coffee machine, right? That's why events can be powerful, because you can get like really, really quick.
Yeah, that is
the right people.
And that is exactly another point that we had, Flo, about engaging with the prospects and asking, thoughtful questions.
Yeah.
So that we can, but as you rightly put it there, you need to be methodical. You need to have an approach. You need to have this conversation to try and gather some insight, not
Yeah.
just sit there and have a water cooler conversation. That's not what we're
Yeah, I
talking.
mean you're exactly right. So we could have a water cooler conversation, but we should make sure that there's several of those. We
Mm-hmm.
always ask the same or at least very similar question, and we do have some way of figuring out who our partner in conversation was in terms of what company they're from, what's their role, right? So you need to explore some of that stuff. So you can, and then to your point of being methodical, you should also have a process for capturing this. Maybe it's a notebook, maybe it's back of a napkin, but at the end of the day, you might be, for example, want to compile it into a spreadsheet and really build up a collection of stories or insights or whatever the thing is. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's a separate episode because I've done some of these, so I have a little bit of a process. I'm not going to say it's extensive, but there are ways you could do those, and I think it's a good way. So let's expand the proxy thing. So it's a good way to read the trade press to prepare yourself content-wise, because you'll be
Mm-hmm.
able to read what are some hot topics, what's stuff that's being discussed, and then also prepare some sort of method. I mean, we've discussed the mum test, right? I have a second book I like, which is the Jobs to be Done playbook. I can put that in
Yeah.
the show notes. That also has an entire chapter dedicated to preparing and structuring conversations and interviews. That that's where I'll leave it. So,
And
trade events, good source of first-hand insights.
but what you
If you
said
do them in
there,
that order,
yeah, but what you said there actually leads on to the next proxy point about scouring review sites like
yeah,
Gartner Peer Insights, G2 Crowd, maybe book reviews. But Flo, you clearly have done this as well.
yeah, that's a cheap trick I pull in order to surprise these and others in presentations at the beginning of projects. I'm surprised that not many people know this, actually, or maybe
Yeah.
I should say, not too many of the marketeers and consulting people I engage with know this. There are people sometimes know services like Capterra or G2 where you can compare software providers and you get in-depth discussions of their solution by people who actually bought it. Now, the same thing, maybe not too surprisingly, exists for, let's say, consulting services above a certain threshold. So yeah, there's not going to be a review site that lists your 60-person shop maybe, but you will find the big ones in the industry, right? I don't know, Capgemini, Deloitte, Accenture, the Indian providers, sometimes maybe even some of the strategy firms. You will find reviews for those on these sites, and they might be very interesting pointers to, for example, things that clients liked about hiring those firms and their
Mm-hmm.
methods, and things they didn't like as much, which I think that's typically interesting, right? To spot some weaknesses. And yeah, if people want to know a few names, there is like Trustpilot is one people might even know here where I live in Germany, and that's sometimes a smaller players. It's not as extensive, but my go-to typically is Gartner Peer Insights. So that's Gartner,
Yeah.
the industry analyst. They have a web service where, people who board services can leave reviews. Or G2 Crowd, you pointed me to that one, Ash. Didn't
Mm-hmm.
know G2 also has service comparisons, but they do. And as we checked it, or as I checked it prior to recording this, the surprising thing here is they even have reviews to specific services. Like if you want to know what I'm making up names now, but what the difference is between Accenture's, I don't know, industry analytics service capability and Capgemini's, well, you can pick those. They literally have service level reviews on those pages. So yeah, that's another
And
interesting one.
and the good thing that you get from these insights is you'll be able to like do a much more thorough persona about the kind of users, what they're looking for, and things like that, because that's something that you clearly will use in your marketing strategy. So use these insights to feed into more insights. And I think while we're talking about like places where we can compare reviews, we should not forget that another proxy method, which you rightly mentioned, is like social media and communities, because people talk about services, people talk about what they've bought in
Yeah.
these areas. So you have subreddits. I think you always love talking about subreddits there, so I will let you go on about that. But I do know about a
I
lot
do.
of
I mean, it's
community. Yeah.
literally if you go into spaces that are dedicated to a certain job role, and there are subreddits for accountants. There's finance stuff. There is the consulting subreddit, which can be hilarious, but it's not always too serious. But sometimes if people have a question, they will literally just put it there, and other people will come and give very reasonable sometimes extensive answers. And you can learn from both. Like you can collect these signals to find out what are the questions people are asking right now and what are the good answers. And to give a very tangible example, there's a subreddit which I'm following for marketing operations. And if you ever wondered what kinds of pains are being created by the deprecation of cookies, right, which is on the horizon, you might have heard of it. But what are the actual implications for the people who actually run the advertising systems, right, down in the trenches in the corporations? What are they struggling with now? Man, you'll probably be able to find 60-80% of the answers in that sub, because these pain points are being discussed there. So I think
regularly,
that's a good one to figure out stuff. It's probably the same idea as the trade press, right? It's just more dynamic, more into the weeds, and also more open and honest, frankly, in many cases, because nobody needs to come across as having all their shit together, but they will literally write, I can't figure out this, I need help sorting that, and then there'll be a discussion.
Yeah, so now if we move on to the fifth point, because hey, we got past 4.
Yeah.
It's we need to get the inputs from the clients. We have to get the business to forward us those things. If like the inquiries, escalation, complaints, and when they've had things like, meetings where they've probably lost a deal or something. But Flo, can't say
no,
no.
I mean that already summarizes it. If they have lunch with somebody and figure out a few things or get an idea for where they might drum up some work, where the client is currently struggling, where there's an upsell and so forth, it would be good if they forwarded that to marketing, or if they fed it into some sort of process of yours. And you could solve for that, or you could create that situation by just building the relationships in-house, right? So having a few good friends who think of you as they have these conversations, good start. Maybe you formalize it a little bit and you have an inbox, some sort of inbox. I'm not necessarily meaning a mail inbox. Could be a Slack channel. It could be something of that sort where people can just dump stuff for you to consider. And yeah, that can be very interesting, especially if you compile these things over time. And I mean, maybe to that point, if you work at a larger place where there's business developments or even sales teams, I used to have those conversations with I would go to lunch with someone who was leading a sales team for an entire region and just pick their brain with regards to what new things do we see prop up in RFPs across the board. Like, I mean, this is no longer the case, but it was interesting to see how suddenly ESG criteria in certain industries started to show up in RFPs, and then suddenly they were everywhere. I mean, this is an obvious one, so it's not that spectacular, but it's interesting because they literally have the finger on the pulse of the hard requirements clients make. And that could also be an interesting
and it's really important because ESG goals end up being a reason why you may or may not invest in a company, which then, as you can imagine, affects overall profit and
I mean, there's another example here which I can maybe share because it's been a while, but I worked with a firm once where we realized that they got objections and in some cases even lost competitive bids because they were trying to win public sector work in certain states in Germany. And those states had very tough requirements around gender equality and the gendering language. There's different pronouns and different verb forms and so forth, different job titles in Germany. And if you did not have him/her or things of that sort in the language of your pitching materials, that would be an issue. Okay, cool. Once we learned that, right, took us 3 days to revamp the website, and it was, I'm not saying business double, but that was one issue less to run up against in the pitching process. So again, small example, but that's what this forwarding of information can yield.
Yeah.
All right. What was that? That makes 3, right? No, that was number 4. Sorry, I'm losing count.
That was 6.
No. Okay. We had the trade press and events, review sites, social medias, ask the business for inputs. And
we also talked about engaging with our prospects because we connected that with our trade press.
Yeah, that was in the events, but you're right. Okay, so but we can back to it. But the next one actually is join client meetings with the practice if you can, right? Do we
Mhm.
need to add any information to that? It seems fairly
No,
straightforward.
we
Just
know it's
ask
not
to come
always
along.
feasible. Yeah, we know it's
Yeah.
not always feasible, but there's no harm in asking.
Yes, and by the way, my experience, particularly good time is after a deal has been won, and maybe there's a kickoff session, maybe there's just a review of the bidding process. I don't know. These sometimes are opportunities. Same is true if a very successful project gets closed. A good pitch to the business leader who manages the account can be that because you are, right, I'm making air quotes, somewhat neutral here, you're not working on the project, you're also not with the client, that sometimes gives you some leeway to ask interesting questions and to collect also feedback on the team or on the project performance, which the business leader might want to have. So you're the best person inside the firm to ask that, because you're not a consultant, you're just marketing, sort of, quote
Yep.
unquote. And that I have used that successfully in the past to sort of, make the ask and rationalize why I should be there or add a additional benefit. Anyways, okay, now we added some stuff to the point, but it's fairly straightforward. Joint client meetings.
It is
Okay.
fairly straightforward.
But back to you engaging with the prospects. We mentioned the trade shows, but we mentioned the trade press events, third-party events. But I think when we wrote down the point, we made something slightly different.
We actually did talk about being methodical in the whole thing as well. So
yeah, but I think the one. So let's just add one simple thing. As consulting firms do their own events, or you might present at the trade show, do make sure that if you are there as a marketer, to have those conversations as well. And I'm putting that out there because I know how hard it is. If you're involved in the organizing and you run around and you're busy during the event, you have other things on top of your mind, just write it down somewhere or find another way to make sure you use some of that exposure you get throughout to have those conversations as well. And it's sometimes as easy as just asking a client if they wanted a coffee, to say, well, I'll get you one if you give me 3 minutes in return and talk to me about this new market you're trying to, whatever. It's very easy, similar to the trade press events or third-party events. Pretty easy to get a yes, especially if you're well prepared and you don't ask 15 questions, but maybe just one, like you said, Ash, one thoughtful one to bring back that insight. What else do we have over here, right? Yeah, win-loss analysis of deals. Do you want to say something about that?
I feel like it's fairly straightforward, but at the same time, when you've had a deal, first of all, speak with the sales team to see what happened. Like, why did you win? What was going on in the room when they discussed? Because sometimes you'll find out that they didn't have all the material at hand, or something just went missing, despite the fact that we could have just won just like anyone else in the room, or even the winning team.
Yeah, we had that, right? You mentioned that. You remind me of it.
Yes.
We had literally had that happen, that the firm lost something because the other peer brought more thought leadership relevant to the topic, and we were like, oh damn it, we would have a shelf full of stuff. We just didn't, for some reason the bidding team didn't bring it, right? And then there's a disconnect there between marketing.
Exactly. That's the whole thing. When people send out these RFPs and when the sales teams are literally in the room having that discussion, they need to be fully prepared, and the loss analysis helps you understand what was missing, what you didn't provide them with. That's one element there. On the win side, you can also look at like how effective and efficient it was, like what was needed to help them win and what wasn't needed. So that way you can like make an optimal package instead of just having a million, as they call it, stage zero decks or planning decks and sales decks. Just provide them with the exact material and the option when they need to reach out for extra stuff, because it's just going to take them like a couple of minutes to say, yes, we also have this. Here you go.
Here's the marketer who runs that program for the business unit. Ask him or her. Yeah, good. That's a good point. I mean, it's actually very similar to asking to join client meetings. It's just, I think the difference in method is either your firm does not have a structured win-loss analysis process and or sales team. In that case, you might prop this up and say, hey, every new deal we win, am I allowed to call the guys and ask why they picked us? Every deal we lose, can I call the guys and ask why we lost? I think the business will respond very positively to that because it's helpful information to them as well. no one else wants to do it, you pick it up. Nice, right? Win-win. Same is true if your firm has these processes. What I see typically is there's an engagement leader or some business development person who's in charge of the deal, and it's typically their job, and typically they have these calls. If they're busy, they will not say no to you coming and volunteering to do it on their behalf and share your results, right? So it's another easy way into the actual conversation with the actual client without any middle man or some technology between you. You can actually just have the conversation. All right, so, last 4. So
yeah, I think it's kind of related to the previous one. Like, you need to have a feedback session when you're running an engagement. Like, don't just think. So here's something that I have seen a lot. Sometimes, and especially this is more prevalent in SaaS companies, also prevalent in services firms, because often on the back of a service you provide a product, and the product will ask for a quantitative type survey, or you may send them a survey, and guess what? You're not going to get the right kind of responses because you're not really reaching out to any, through any massive firm or massive outreach to give them this good survey. It's nice, but it's not going to give the kind of information that you need. So how else can you reach out? Phone calls?
So feedback,
emails, things like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Feedback session for running engagements. Yeah, phone calls or emails. Important, again, the idea you having the conversation. And again, the difference here is just, this is not a win-loss analysis. This is not just some random client meeting, but you do a formal review of the client relationship. And I think many firms do those. They build up client satisfactory scores or something like that, right? Maybe not every year, but for longer running engagements, they'll do it every 2 years or something like that. Again, volunteer to do those, and voila, you'll find yourself in a situation where you can, learn quite a bunch about the client if you insert 1 or 2 thoughtful questions to the actual satisfactory survey, not just the CSAT questions. You can maybe ask something else, and you'll be golden, as I say. Moving on to our third last idea on the list of 11. Drive your own exploratory interviews. LinkedIn cold outreach is your friend. Literally can say that with confidence and from experience. I've done that for our own firm as we built out our messaging and service portfolio. I would just find ICP representatives using the LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I would write them a friendly in-mail message, not some spam shit, asking them, being very open, like saying, we're building this. We're trying to validate a couple of hypotheses that go into the service. Would you be willing to, and then we had some variation. Either we asked for a 15-minute phone call, which enough people actually agreed to, or we would send, again, 1 or 2 thoughtful, very short questions. And I know it's probably not market research best practice, but we made them closed ones, right? So you can either say yes or no. Doesn't give you the full breadth of information. It's definitely not as good as a conversation, but it can give you data points to validate hypothesis, and it's a next best action, so to speak, in that cadence. So I've also successfully tested cold outreaches where I did both. I said, would you be willing to either hop on a call, or if you don't have time for that, at least answer me this question, question, yes, no. And the response rate for that version was higher than for any of the standalone options. And if you want to see my numbers, no problem with those. I initially hit response rates of, it's 2 stages, so it's a bit difficult, between 30 and 40% acceptance rate for the connection request, right? We're talking LinkedIn. And then out of those 30 of 100 people, again, 25 to, I think, maybe top that's something like 36%, which I thought was phenomenally high. Actually did agree to give some type of information back. I do not know the number of calls on top of my head. I would guess that was less than half. So it's definitely not too many people, but you should be able to get enough out of those. And I learned, by the way, through that process that for idea validation, you don't need a dozen interviews. I think product developers know this, or product designers, that for exploratory interviews, you'll be able to recognize the first patterns after 6 interviews. And I forgot, I have to dig up the reasoning for that. There's some statistics behind that. So you might need not even 10 to get to what you're driving towards. So yeah, and I can recommend the direct outreach as well.
So I'd like to add, Flo, that consulting marketers take note. this is what we also mean by some of the proxy stuff, because Flow literally here gave you qualitative insight on what, on how you can do this. This is another example of how you can source information when you look at different channels.
Yeah, that is true. Because you're right. I mean, the majority of that effort then did not result in conversations. So yeah, we should say it's probably a proxy, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, it builds your LinkedIn connection network, which can be interesting for marketing down the road. But
Yes.
leaving that aside, second to last one. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Well, I did talk about the research survey part. If you're doing one, drive it yourself, because you need to think about how you're doing the research. You probably need to look at your existing clients. You need to look at your prospective clients. Maybe do a 50-50 split, or however you think you can build a split right. But you need to put some effort behind this research survey. It's not like, yes, you don't have $1 million to spend on a massive thing, but you have time. So use that time and you do it effectively, and use what Flo was talking about in terms of cold outreach. Plus, take the time that you've been doing to do, the feedback session, and also, engagement in other places to drive the survey. The survey is not going to be, I have a questionnaire I want you to fill. You might need to get it while running these different kinds of engagements and, outreach. And that's how you can build a very qualitative research survey, which is A, dependent on your time, B, dependent on your effort, and therefore it'll be low cost but high value.
Yeah.
So
and that brings us to the last one. Point 11. I think you might even consider this a version of the survey, or maybe not. It's a paid for version of the interviews, but you could leverage expert networks. And something I think is very well known actually in the consulting world on the practice side. I don't see it mentioned that often on the marketing team side, but there are expert networks like GLG. There's one called Alpha Sites, this Third Bridge, maybe a bunch of others. Essentially, these are websites where you go on, you post a description of the people you want to interview and the kinds of information you're looking for, and then you pay for each interview with an expert they broker to you, and the rates there might vary wildly depending on, are you trying to interview just any type of cloud software engineer, or do you need to speak to the CIO, right? So, I left the CFO example, darn it. But I think so. Prices for interviews, I have not the highest visibility into that space, but I've seen it range from anywhere between 200, 250 to 800, 600 sometimes. I think Ari mentioned that 1,600, 2,000 euros per very senior decision maker. But it can be worth it if you have some budget, spending, I don't know, 12 grand, and you get to talk to the 6 interviews you just mentioned are actually with Fortune 500, I don't know, VPs of sales or whatever. It can be very helpful, and maybe, you can get the practice to co-sponsor it because they typically want to hear this stuff as well. So that's that. And that concludes the list of our 11. And I think we're closely at time anyway. So I saved a 12th one, which we didn't even promise because it's a surprise bonus idea for the end. I don't know if you can guess it. People could, of course, literally do the same stuff we do here, which is just run a podcast for the firm and interview your ideal clients. Why not, right?
Yeah.
You could create the podcast for your ideal clients, like the stuff they would like to hear. You probably need some sort of subject matter expert to host it or moderate it, but you can involve yourself into producing it. You could be the producer, right? And through that, get exposure to those conversations. And that can be, and we're certainly not the first ones to give you this idea, but we just need to add it at the end, can certainly give you a ton of insight and interesting things to work with. Well, I would definitely say we learned a ton here, right, Ash, from the interviews we do occasionally, although we're not necessarily, I wouldn't say that's our ideal clients, but there's people in our industry, so or operators from consulting firms. So we definitely leveled up quite a bit just by having those conversations. And you kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? You create marketing content and you get the insights. So that's probably the best idea ever. No, in fact, don't do a podcast, right? We don't want this
Just
to
keep
be
listening.
too
Just
competitive.
keep listening to us.
Yeah, just listen to ours, and there you have it.
Yeah. So
Nice. Was that a quick one? No, I think we're
no, it was fairly long, but it was useful.
fairly long.
What I would just say last is we did talk about 12 points at the end, and if you would rather read, check the show notes because these 12
Yeah,
points will be listed out there.
it's a veritable blog post almost.
Yes.
Like it's 2 pages in my notes. You're right, it was a longer one. Time flew by for me because I was just eager to get through the points. Anyways, good stuff, Ash. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording here, and all that's left to say is have a nice Friday and weekend eventually.
Yes.
Or a good start into the week if you listen to this later. Anyways,
Yes.
speak soon.
Speak soon.
Thanks for listening to Unbillable Hours. If you want more, tune in next week. You know where to find us.